Chapter 1, Odin's unexpected request in the eternal halls of Asgard, where the sky always shimmered with golden light, and the winds carried the scent of eternal spring. Odin, the All-Father, sat upon his high throne Hlidsgjálf. His single eye gazed out over the world, but today it seemed not to see the 9 realms as it usually did. Instead, it was filled with a deep sigh, one that echoed through Valhalla like a gust from Jotunheim. The gods had been so down lately. Thor sat staring into his hammer Mjolnir as if it were a mirror reflecting his own boredom. Freyja no longer played with her cats, she merely sat sighing over her necklaces. Even Balder, the eternally smiling one, seemed to have lost his luster. He sat fiddling with an arrow as if contemplating shooting himself in the foot for some excitement. Odin scratched his long, grey beard. "This won't do," he muttered to himself. "We need something to shake us up, something fun, a prank." His eye flashed, but who could he trust with such a task? Not Thor, he'd just smash everything with his hammer, not Tyr too serious. No, there was only one god expert in chaos and mischief. Loki, the cunning, the unpredictable, the one who always turned everything upside down without getting a scratch himself. With a wave of his hand, Odin sent out his ravens, Hugin and Munin, to fetch Loki. They flew through the sky like black lightning, and soon Loki stood before the throne, his red hair flaming like a fire and a grin that could melt ice giants. He bowed deeply, but his eyes glinted with suspicion. "All-Father," he said in his silky voice, "to what do I owe the honor? Have you finally realized the world needs a bit more spice?" Odin rose slowly, his mantle of stars and shadows swirling around him. He looked down at Loki, and for the first time in ages, Loki felt genuine surprise. Odin's face was not stern, not judgmental, it was pleading. "Loki, my old friend and foe," Odin began, his voice thundering like lightning, but with an undertone of desperation. "Asgard has become a place of sighs and yawns. The gods seem so down, as if Ragnarok has already come and we've all lost. Thor hasn't struck a giant in weeks, he just sits eating goat meat and complaining about the weather. Frey has forgotten how to cultivate, and Heimdall stares out over Bifrost as if waiting for a delivery that never arrives." Loki chuckled, a loud, ringing laugh that made the Valkyries twitch in their armor. "Oh, All-Father, you're right. I've noticed it myself. Even I have felt bored. I tried tricking Sif into thinking her golden hair was a wig yesterday, but she just shrugged and said, 'What does it matter?'" He spun on his heel, his cloak fluttering dramatically. "So what do you suggest? Shall we call Fenrisulfur for a playdate?" Odin shook his head, but a small smile crept under his beard. "No, Loki, I need your help with something bigger. A prank, a massive, mad prank on all the gods of Asgard. Something to make them laugh, rage, and live again. It must happen right here in Asgard, among us all, so no one escapes it. And it must end with a grand feast where we all toast to life and chaos." Loki froze, his eyes widening. "You are asking for my help, Odin himself, god of wisdom, begging the trickster for a prank. Oh, this is better than when I stole Idun's apples." He clapped his hands in delight, and small sparks of magic sputtered out. "Tell me more, All-Father. What are you thinking? Shall we turn Thor's hammer into a feather? Make Freyja's cats talk like philosophers? Or perhaps let Balder believe he's invisible?" Odin sat down again, leaning forward with a conspiratorial look. "Not quite. I want it to be personal, something that hits each god's weak spot, but in a way that makes them laugh at themselves in the end. We'll start by gathering them all in Valhalla for a crucial council meeting. You, Loki, will kick it off. But we must plan it perfectly. Nothing can go wrong, or at least not in a way that ruins the feast." The two gods sat there for hours, whispering and laughing. Loki suggested one wilder idea after another. Swapping Midgard's serpent's venom for sparkling water, making Heimdall hear false horn signals from all directions, letting Tyr think his hand had regrown, but as a chicken wing. Odin nodded, dismissing some ideas as too dangerous. "We don't want to start Ragnarok for real, Loki." But his eye shone with youthful energy for the first time in ages. As the sun set over Asgard's golden towers, Loki finally rose. "This will be legendary, All-Father, but remember, when the chaos breaks loose, don't be the one pointing fingers at me." He winked and vanished in a swirl of smoke, leaving Odin alone with a smile he hadn't worn since he hung from Yggdrasil. Outside Valhalla, the gods wandered unaware of what was to come. Thor fiddled with his beard, muttering about rainy days. Freyja stroked her cats distractedly, and Balder sat staring at a flower as if it held the universe's secrets. But in the shadows lurked Loki, already plotting the first step in their grand prank. Asgard would soon awaken from its slumber, with laughter, chaos, and a feast that would echo through 9 worlds. Chapter 2, Loki's cunning preparations. Asgard lay wrapped in a morning mist that glittered like spun gold, and at its heart, Loki prowled like a fox in a henhouse. His red hair glowed like a torch in the dawn, and his smile was so wide it could have cracked Bifrost itself. Odin had given him free rein, or as free as the All-Father's wary eye allowed, to unleash the grand prank, and Loki was not one to hold back. He had spent the night wandering Valhalla's corridors, whispering to himself and giggling like a child who'd just been handed the keys to a honey jar. But this was no ordinary mischief. This was a prank that would shake Asgard's pillars, make the gods laugh, swear, and perhaps even hurl a lightning bolt or two, before they all toasted with mead at the grand feast. Loki began the day by calling a crucial council meeting in Valhalla, just as Odin had ordered. He sent out small fire-spitting salamanders, his own invention, carrying messages written on glowing parchment. Each salamander scurried to a god with a dramatic summons. Odin calls, crucial meeting in Valhalla at midday, come or risk the All-Father's wrath. Loki could hardly contain his laughter imagining Thor's face when a salamander leapt into his beard to deliver the message. He pictured Freyja wrinkling her nose at the burnt scent of the parchment, and Heimdall hearing the salamanders a mile off, yet still being annoyed by their cheeky demeanor. While the salamanders did their work, Loki headed to Valhalla's great hall to set the stage. The hall was vast, with pillars carved like the roots of the world tree and a ceiling that shimmered with stars. In the center stood the long table where the gods usually feasted, now covered with a cloth that glittered like the northern lights. But today, the table would not just be a place for mead jugs and tailies, it would be the heart of Loki's prank. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder to ensure no one saw him, then began his magic. First, he focused on Thor's spot at the table. Thor, the thunder god who could crush mountains with a hammer strike, had a weakness: his pride in his strength. Loki chuckled and cast a spell over Thor's chair, a subtle magic that would make it feel like it was made of feathers. Each time Thor sat, the chair would sink slightly, as if unable to bear his weight, and emit an embarrassing creaking sound like a goat getting its tail caught in a door. "Oh Thor, my friend," Loki murmured, "let's see how your confidence handles a chair that insults you." Next on the list was Freyja, the goddess of love and beauty, whose vanity was as legendary as her jewels. Loki crept to her spot and conjured a small mirror, hiding it under the table. The mirror was enchanted. Every time Freyja glanced down at it, and she would, for who could resist their own reflection, it would show her with a ridiculous hairstyle, perhaps a bird's nest of twigs or a wig that looked like sheep's wool. But the mirror would also whisper over-the-top compliments. "Oh, Freyja, you are a vision of unique style." Loki could already hear her confused shriek. For Heimdall, the watchman with eyes that could spot an ant crawling in Midgard, Loki had something extra cunning in store. He placed a small crystal on the table at Heimdall's spot, a crystal pulsing with false images. Each time Heimdall looked at it, he would see absurd events: a troupe of dwarves dancing ballet on Bifrost, or a giant trying to ride one of Thor's goats. The crystal would also emit false sound signals, like a horn blowing from nowhere, to make Heimdall think he was missing something critical. "Let's see how the world's best watchman handles being tricked by his own sharpness," Loki giggled. Balder, the beloved and beautiful, was next. His weakness was his goodness. He couldn't resist trying to please everyone. Loki hid a small box under Balder's chair, a box that, when opened, would release a swarm of enchanted butterflies. But these were no ordinary butterflies. They would flutter around Balder and form words in the air like, "You're too perfect," or "Stop smiling, it's annoying," in glittering letters. The idea was to distract Balder so much with trying to calm the butterflies that he'd forget his own smile for a moment. Finally, Loki turned to Tyr's spot. The war god, who had sacrificed his hand to Fenrisulfur, was always so serious. Loki decided to give him a little gift, a glove lying on the table, seemingly innocent. But when Tyr put it on, and he would, for a warrior couldn't resist a glove, it would start waving its fingers uncontrollably, as if alive. It would point at other gods, make rude gestures, and even try to tickle Tyr under the chin. "Let's see how stoic you are now, Tyr," Loki laughed. With the preparations complete, Loki headed to the kitchen, where the Valkyries were preparing the mead for the meeting. He slipped a small vial of a special blend he called laughter syrup into the mead. It was no dangerous potion. It would just make the gods laugh uncontrollably at the most inappropriate moments, like when Odin tried to deliver a serious speech. Loki could barely wait to see Thor laugh so hard he overturned the table, or Freyja giggle mid-rant about her mirror image. As midday approached, the gods began streaming into Valhalla. Thor arrived first, as usual, with Mjolnir dangling from his hand. He cast a suspicious glance at Loki, who stood in a corner pretending to polish a knife. "What are you up to, trickster?" Thor growled. "Nothing good, I wager," Loki blinked innocently. "Oh, Thor, I'm just here to serve the All-Father. Aren't you curious about what Odin has in mind?" Thor grunted, but said no more, sitting down, and the chair immediately emitted a loud, creaking sound. Thor leapt up as if strung by a wasp. "What in Helheim's name?" he roared. As the chair sank slightly under his weight, Loki bit his lip to keep from bursting out laughing. Freyja came next, her cats slinking after her like shadows. She glanced at the table, and her eyes were immediately drawn to the mirror. "What's this?" she murmured, bending down. The mirror showed her with a hairstyle like an exploded haystack, and a voice whispered, "Freyja, your beauty is unmatched," she shrieked and tossed her hair, which only made the mirror's image worse. Heimdall arrived with his usual vigilant expression, but when he sat, the crystal began showing images of dancing dwarves. His eyes narrowed. "What is this nonsense?" he muttered, but when a false horn echoed through the hall, he sprang up like a flash. "Invasion!" he shouted, before realizing no one else heard it. He sat again, blushing, a feat for a god. Balder entered with his usual radiant smile, but when he sat, the box under his chair opened, and butterflies swarmed out. "You're too perfect," the words glowed in the air, and Balder flailed, trying to shoo them away, his smile turning into a confused laugh. Tyr, last of all, put on the glove, and it immediately began waving wildly, pointing at Loki as if accusing him. "Loki," Tyr roared, but the glove tickled him under the chin, and he couldn't hold back a laugh. When Odin finally entered, his mantle swirling like a storm, the hall was already in chaos. Thor wrestled with his chair, Freyja swore at her mirror, Heimdall stared suspiciously at the crystal, Balder chased butterflies, and Tyr grappled with his own glove. Odin cast a quick glance at Loki, who stood in the corner feigning innocence. "What have you done?" Odin whispered, but his eye glinted with amusement. "Meeting," Odin called, and the gods tried to gather themselves. But when the mead was served and the laughter syrup took effect, all hell broke loose. Thor laughed so hard he toppled the chair, Freyja giggled mid-rage, and even Odin couldn't keep a straight face as he tried to speak. Loki stood in the shadows and smiled. The prank had only just begun. Chapter 3, Chaos Breaks Loose. Valhalla's great hall vibrated with a strange mix of laughter, curses, and confused shouts. It was as if Yggdrasil itself had decided to shake its roots and laugh at the gods. Loki's prank had triggered a chain reaction no one could ignore, and even the most stoic of Asgard's inhabitants began to lose their composure. Thor stood upside down with his chair, which now not only creaked but wobbled like a drunk goat on ice. Freyja had given up trying to understand the mirror, which now showed her with a hairstyle like an entire forest of twigs and leaves, complete with a little bird chirping merrily at the top. Heimdall stared at his crystal, his eyes so wide they might have rolled out of his skull, as images of dancing dwarves turned into a giant juggling fire-spitting salamanders. Balder ran around trying to catch his enchanted butterflies, which now formed the words "Smile less, Balder." In the air, while Tyr wrestled with his glove, which had begun dancing its own version of a war dance on the table. Odin stood at the table's end, his spear Gungnir in hand, trying with all his authority to restore order. "Silence," he thundered, but his voice was choked by a sudden giggle as the laughter syrup began to affect him too. He tried to cover it with a cough, which only made the gods laugh harder. Thor, who had just managed to sit again, fell backward as the chair gave up entirely and collapsed into a heap of splinters. "Loki," he roared, but his voice broke into a laugh that sounded like a thunderclap mixed with a stifled hiccup. Loki himself stood in the shadows, his smile wider than ever. He had planned this moment for days, and now he watched his work bloom like a mad flower in Midgard's gardens. But he wasn't done yet. This was just the warm-up. The prank would escalate, and he had a series of new tricks up his sleeve to drive the gods to the brink of madness, only to pull them back with laughter and wonder. "Honored gods," Odin called, finally regaining control of his laughter. "We are gathered here to discuss—" he hesitated, realizing he had no reason for the meeting other than to set Loki's plan in motion. "Important matters, yes, very important matters." He cast a quick glance at Loki, who nodded encouragingly from the corner. But before Odin could continue, something unexpected happened. Loki's next trick kicked off, and it was a masterpiece of chaos. He had hidden small runestones around the hall, each charged with a spell to affect the environment. With a discreet snap of his fingers, he activated them, and suddenly Valhalla's walls shimmered in all the colors of the rainbow, as if Bifrost itself had moved in. The floor began to vibrate, not enough to topple anyone, but enough to make the gods stumble as if they'd had too much mead. And from the ceiling, small, glittering snowflakes began to fall, not ordinary snowflakes. These were enchanted to sing little songs, each with lyrics mocking the gods in a playful way. One snowflake landed on Thor's nose and sang, "Thor, your hammer is big, but your chair is a bore." Another floated down to Freyja and chirped, "Beauty in excess, but the mirror gives advice." Freyja tossed her hair and tried to wave the snowflakes away, but they danced around her and kept singing. "This is unbearable," she shrieked, but her voice broke into a giggle as a snowflake landed on her cheek and sang about her cats. Thor, now standing again, tried to swat the snowflakes with Mjolnir, but each strike only multiplied them, and soon he was surrounded by a choir of tiny voices mocking his beard. Heimdall, usually the epitome of calm, began to look like he might explode. His crystal now showed an image of himself dancing ballet on Bifrost in a tutu, and he could no longer tell what was real and what was Loki's trick. "This is an outrage," he roared, but his voice drowned in laughter as the laughter syrup made him giggle mid-rage. Balder, always the peacemaker, ran around trying to catch the snowflakes to silence them, but his butterflies had now teamed up with the snowflakes, creating a cacophony of glittering chaos. "Please calm down," he shouted, but his smile was now so wide it looked like he was enjoying the madness himself. Tyr, still struggling with his glove, had begun to accept its behavior. He held it up as if it were an old friend and said, "Fine, you win this time." But when the glove suddenly started patting his cheek like an over-enthusiastic Valkyrie, he couldn't hold back and burst into laughter that echoed through the hall. Odin, trying to maintain his dignity, realized he couldn't hold the meeting under these circumstances. He slammed Gungnir into the floor, and a boom echoed through the hall, strong enough to silence the snowflakes for a moment. "Loki," he called, his voice both stern and amused. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Loki stepped forward from the shadows, his hands outstretched in a gesture of innocence. "Me," he said in a voice so smooth it could melt butter. "I'm just a humble servant, All-Father. Perhaps it's Yggdrasil itself deciding to prank us." He winked, and the gods stared at him with a mix of anger and laughter. Even Thor, usually ready to hurl Mjolnir at the slightest provocation, couldn't help but laugh as a snowflake landed on his forehead and sang, "Thor, your strength is great, but your chair is a snot." Odin sighed, but his eye glinted with pleasure. "Carry on then, Loki," he said, "but see to it that this leads somewhere. We need more than chaos, we need a feast." Loki bowed deeply, his smile wider than ever. "Oh, All-Father, worry not. This is just the beginning. Before the night is over, Asgard will shake with laughter, and the feast will be one that sings through the worlds." With that, Loki vanished in a swirl of smoke, leaving the gods to deal with the chaos. But he wasn't far off. He had already begun planning the next phase of the prank, which would take them out of Valhalla and into Asgard's vast landscape. He had ideas of turning Freyja's cats into giant, fluffy versions of themselves, making Thor's goats run around singing like a choir, and perhaps even tricking Heimdall into thinking Bifrost had started dancing on its own. But the key was to keep the gods on their toes, to make them forget their worries and laugh until their sides ached. As evening fell over Asgard, and the gods began to recover from the chaos in Valhalla, they noticed something new was afoot. A mysterious invitation, written in glowing runes, appeared at each god's door. "Come to Asgard's great meadow tonight. A surprise awaits. Signed, a friend." The gods exchanged suspicious glances, but curiosity, and perhaps the laughter syrup, drove them to follow the invitation. What Loki had planned out there, under the stars, would be the next step in his grand prank, and it would lead them straight to the feast Odin had requested. Chapter 4: The Nighttime Foolery on Asgard's Meadow. As night fell over Asgard, the golden towers bathed in a silver-blue glow from the moon, which hung over the sky like a curious Valkyrie. The gods, still shaken by the chaos in Valhalla, had reluctantly but curiously followed the glowing rune's invitation to Asgard's great meadow. The meadow was a vast place, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind and strewn with flowers that glowed like tiny stars. It was a spot for feasts, ceremonies, and, as it now seemed, Loki's next big prank. The air was thick with tense anticipation, mingled with suspicion. Everyone knew Loki was behind this, but no one could resist the temptation to see what he had in store. Thor led the way, Mjolnir gripped tightly, his beard still full of glitter from the singing snowflakes. "If this is another of your tricks, Loki, I swear by Yggdrasil's roots I'll hurl you to Jotunheim," he growled, but his voice carried an undertone of curiosity. Freyja walked beside him, her cats slinking after her, their eyes glinting suspiciously. She had tried to remove the mirror's enchantment from her hair, but each time she combed it, a new twig appeared, and she had begun to accept that she looked like a walking forest. Heimdall strode with long, vigilant steps, his eyes sweeping the meadow as if expecting an army of dwarves to appear in tutus. Balder tried to keep spirits up, but his smile was strained after chasing butterflies all day, and Tyr clutched his enchanted glove tightly, as if ready to fight should it try to tickle him again. Odin brought up the rear, his mantle sweeping the ground like a shadow of stars. His single eye glittered with a mix of anticipation and worry. He had given Loki free rein, but he knew the trickster's plans could spiral out of control faster than one of Thor's goats on the loose. Yet he couldn't deny that Asgard felt alive again. The gods were no longer gloomy, but filled with an energy that crackled like lightning. When they reached the meadow's center, torches flared to life around them, not with ordinary fire, but with light shifting in rainbow colors, as if Bifrost had been shattered and scattered across the ground. A high platform rose from the grass, and there stood Loki, clad in a cloak that shimmered like liquid gold. He held his arms outstretched, like a ringmaster ready to present the evening's show. "Welcome, my friends," he cried, his voice echoing over the meadow like a silver bell. "Welcome to Asgard's nighttime foolery, where no one is safe and all are part of the game." The gods exchanged glances. "What in Helheim's name is this?" Thor muttered, but before he could say more, the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. And then his beloved goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, emerged from the darkness, but they were not themselves. They were enormous, the size of small mountains, their fur glittering as if bathed in stardust. And to everyone's astonishment, they began to sing. Not just sing, they performed a choral song, with deep, rumbling voices singing of Thor's deeds, but with a twist. "Thor, king of thunder, but your chair is so thin. The hammer is mighty, but snowflakes are cunning." Thor stared at them, his mouth agape, before bursting into a laugh so loud it shook the trees. "Loki, you madman," he shouted, but he couldn't help clapping along to the tune. Freyja's cats were the next targets. They suddenly began to grow, their fur fluffier than clouds, and they started racing around the meadow like giant, playful kittens. But instead of chasing mice, they chased Freyja, who ran around screaming, "My darlings, what has he done to you?" One cat gently caught her in its mouth and lifted her into the air as if she were a toy. The audience, the gods and even the Valkyries who had sneaked in, erupted in laughter as Freyja hung there, kicking her legs, while the cat licked her cheek with a tongue the size of a rug. "Loki, I'll skin you," she shrieked, but her laughter betrayed her. Heimdall, who thought he was prepared for anything, soon got his share. Bifrost itself, the bridge he guarded, appeared as an illusion over the meadow, but it didn't behave like a bridge. It began to dance, undulating up and down like a snake, and upon it ran a group of enchanted illusions of Heimdall himself, all dressed in ridiculous outfits, one in a feathered skirt, another in armor made of flowers. They shouted, "Heimdall, look at us. We guard better than you." Heimdall tried to maintain his dignity, but when one of the illusions began juggling his own sword, he burst into laughter that echoed across the meadow. Poor Balder thought he'd seen the worst, but Loki had saved something special for him. A huge flower grew from the ground, and from its petals emerged a choir of small, glittering elves who sang a serenade in his honor. "Balder, so beautiful, but why so kind? Let loose, go wild, be a bit like a wile." Balder tried to protest, but the elves began tossing glittering pollen at him, turning his clothes every color imaginable. Soon he stood there, clad in a cloak that looked like an exploded rainbow, and even he couldn't help laughing at his own absurdity. Tyr, who had started to get used to his glove's antics, was surprised when it suddenly flew off his hand and began leading a dance with the Valkyries. The glove spun around, performed pirouettes, and even tried to flirt with one of the Valkyries, who giggled and swatted it away. Tyr threw his hands up and shouted, "Fine, Loki, you win." "I give up." His laughter was so infectious that even the sternest Valkyries began to dance along. Odin, watching from the side, couldn't help but smile. He had asked for a prank to awaken Asgard, and Loki had delivered. But he knew the trickster wasn't done yet. As the gods began to adjust to the chaos on the meadow, Loki raised his hands, and a massive portal opened in the meadow's center. From it streamed a flow of glittering light, shaping itself into a path that wound through the meadow and led to an enormous feast spread. Gold garlands floated in the air, serving platters spun like tops, and the food changed flavor with every bite, from honey mead to spicy Jotunheim stew. Thor roared with laughter as his goblet evaded his grasp and spilled mead down his beard. "Loki, you devil, even my drink mocks me." Freyja's plate served her a cake slice that turned into a wriggling fish, and she screamed, half in anger, half in delight. Heimdall's goblet whispered insults about his vigilance, and Balder's food sang a duet with his elves, while Tyr's plate danced a jig with his glove, much to the delight of the gathered Valkyries. Loki leapt onto the table and bowed theatrically. "My friends, the night is young and the jokes are many. Eat, drink, and laugh, for tonight we banish gloom from Asgard." The gods raised their mischievous goblets, despite themselves, their laughter echoing over the meadow. Even Odin joined in, his deep laugh like rolling thunder, as he toasted to chaos and camaraderie. But Loki wasn't finished. As the feast continued, he whispered a final spell, and the stars above began to reshape, forming words in the sky. "Loki rules Asgard." Thor nearly choked on his mead, Freyja hurled a fish at the sky, and Heimdall swore to guard the stars better next time. Yet they all laughed, their spirits lifted, their hearts lighter than they had been in eons. As the night waned, the gods began to tire, their laughter turning into warm smiles. Loki, sensing the moment, clapped his hands, and the portal glowed brighter, revealing a path back to Valhalla. "To the great feast," he exclaimed, and the gods followed, their steps lighter, their voices raised in song. The meadow faded behind them, but the memory of this night would linger, a spark to ignite joy until the final feast was ready. Chapter 5. The Great Feast and the Giants' Ballet. Asgard glowed under a sky ablaze with stars, as if Yggdrasil itself had scattered its glittering seeds across the night. Valhalla's halls were once again the center of attention, but this time it was not chaos that reigned, it was the time of the feast. Loki's prank had roused the gods from their gloom, and now they were ready to toast, laugh, and perhaps even forgive the trickster for his madness. But Loki, true to his nature, had one final surprise in store, and this time he had enlisted Odin himself in the grand finale. The All-Father had whispered to Loki during the night on the meadow, his eye glinting with mischief. "Let's end with something that will leave all of Asgard gaping, something even the giants won't forget." And Loki, with a smile that could have melted the ice of Niflheim, had nodded and said, "Let it be so, All-Father." Valhalla's great hall was transformed. The walls shimmered as if woven from the northern lights, and the ceiling was open to the sky, where the stars still bore traces of Loki's earlier message, "Loki rules Asgard," now changed to "Cheers to Asgard," after a stern glance from Thor. Long tables groaned under golden platters filled with steaming meat dishes, glittering fruits that tasted of sun and moon, and jugs of mead that never seemed to empty. The Valkyries floated about, their armor gleaming like polished silver, serving the gods with smiles that were as mocking as they were warm. They had, after all, been victims of Loki's pranks earlier that day. The gods were in high spirits. Thor had given up trying to figure out why his goats still occasionally bleated a tune, and he raised his goblet with a roar that shook the pillars. "To Asgard, to laughter. And to Loki, the damned madman," he shouted, and the gods cheered, though Freyja cast a meaningful glance at the trickster. Her cats, now back to their normal size, lay at her feet and purred, but now and then they cast a suspicious glance at Loki, as if they knew he wasn't done yet. Heimdall had set his crystal aside, but his eyes still swept the hall, as if awaiting the next trick. Balder, clad in a cloak that still shimmered with rainbow colors, smiled so broadly it was as if he were a sun himself. And Tyr, who had finally tamed his glove, or perhaps it had tired of tickling him, raised his goblet with a sigh of relief. Odin sat at the table's end, his spear Gungnir leaning against the throne, his mantle like a river of stars. He gazed over his gods, and for the first time in eons, he felt warmth in his chest. Asgard was alive again, filled with laughter and life. But he knew the feast wasn't complete without the final act, the one he and Loki had secretly planned. He cast a glance at the trickster, who stood at a table pretending to pour mead, but his eyes glinted with anticipation. Loki clapped his hands, and the hall fell silent. All turned to him, some with smiles, others with wary looks. "Honored gods, Valkyries, and goats," he began, with a wink at Thor, who grunted but laughed. "We've laughed, we've sworn, we've chased butterflies and danced with gloves. But now, my friends, it's time for the grand finale of the evening, a spectacle no one in the 9 worlds will ever forget." He made a dramatic gesture, and a portal opened in the hall's center, a whirl of light and smoke, scented with Jotunheim's cold winds. Out stepped, to everyone's surprise, 4 giants. Not just any giants, these were the notorious brothers from Jotunheim. Skrymir, the colossal one whose steps made the ground tremble, Thrym, whose beard was like a snowstorm, Thrym, who once tried to steal Thor's hammer to marry Freyja, and Gerd, the slightly less fearsome but still imposing giant whom Frey had fallen for. They stood there, enormous and hesitant, their eyes darting nervously across the hall. Their armor of ice and stone glittered in the light, but their faces were pale with fear. They had been summoned by Odin himself, and they were convinced they'd be punished for something, perhaps for existing, or for troubling Asgard one too many times. Thor rose, his hand on Mjolnir. "What is this, Loki? Giants in Valhalla? Is this your way of starting Ragnarok?" But Odin raised a hand to silence him, his smile calming yet mysterious. "Patience, Thor," he said. "This is part of the feast." Loki leapt onto a table, his cloak fluttering like a firestorm. "My friends, allow me to present the evening's highlight, the Giants' Ballet." He snapped his fingers, and the music began, not the usual booming war tunes that echoed in Valhalla, but a light, effervescent melody that sounded as if elves and Valkyries had teamed up to create a symphony. The giants stared at each other, their eyes wide as shields. They had received strict orders from Odin: dance or face his wrath. What they didn't know was that Odin had no intention of punishing them. This was his and Loki's way of adding a final, humorous flourish to the feast. Skrymir, the largest of them, took a tentative step forward, and his foot made the floor quake. He attempted a pirouette, but it looked more like a mountain trying to spin on a pin. He flailed his arms, thick as tree trunks, and his face was a mask of panic. I'm no dancer," he stammered, but the music drove him on, and he began to move in something vaguely resembling a waltz. Trim, with his snowy beard, tried to follow, but his attempt at a graceful move resulted in him tripping over a bench, sending the gods into fits of laughter. Thrym, still remembering Freyja's rejection, tried to impress with a deep bow, but his armor creaked so loudly it sounded like a falling tree. Gerd, the most agile of them, managed a small spin, but his nervous glance at Odin revealed he was convinced this was his last moment. The gods couldn't hold back. Thor laughed so hard he spilled mead across the table. Freyja clapped her hands and shouted, "Dance, Thrym, dance. Maybe you'll win my hand this time." Even Heimdall, usually stoic, giggled so much he had to wipe tears from his eyes. Balder ran forward to show the giants an elegant move, but he tripped over Gerd's foot and landed in a pile of glittering pollen, which only heightened the laughter. Tyr, whose glove now lay still at his side, yelled, "Come on, Skrymir, show us what Jotunheim has to offer," and tossed a bread roll that hit the giant on the forehead. Odin himself rose, his mantle swirling like a galaxy, and raised Gungnir. "Dance, my friends," he cried, his voice filled with a joy the gods rarely heard. The giants, still believing their lives hung by a thread, threw themselves into the dance with a desperation that was both touching and hysterically funny. Skrymir tried a hopping move, but landed so hard a pillar in Valhalla wobbled. Thrym swung his arms as if trying to fly, and Thrym performed a series of jumps that shook the entire hall. Gerd, starting to get the hang of it, spun round and round until he grew dizzy and fell over, triggering a new wave of laughter. Loki, directing it all from the table, added a final touch. He snapped his fingers, and small light specks began to float around the giants, like dancing elves. The light formed crowns above their heads, and suddenly they looked like the most improbable ballet dancers in the 9 worlds. The gods applauded wildly, some tossing flowers, others bread, and even the Valkyries began to dance along, their armor clinking in time with the music. As the dance reached its climax, and the giants, sweaty and breathless, stood in the hall's center, Odin raised his goblet. "To Asgard," he cried, "to laughter, to chaos, and to giants who dance." The giants, still terrified, suddenly realized no wrath awaited them. Odin's smile was warm, and the gods' cheers were genuine. Skrymir blinked in confusion, Thrym scratched his beard, Thrym bowed so deeply he nearly fell over, and Gerd smiled tentatively, as if he couldn't quite believe his own luck. Loki hopped down from the table and bowed deeply. "And so, my friends, we conclude this prank. Let us eat, drink, and remember this night as the one when Asgard laughed as never before." The feast continued until dawn, with songs, laughter, and tales echoing through Valhalla. The giants, now realizing they were honored guests rather than victims, sat at the tables and ate with the gods, their laughter mingling with Thor's booming voice and Freyja's tinkling giggles. As the sun rose over Asgard and the gods finally began to doze at the tables, Odin and Loki stood alone at the hall's end. "You did it, Loki," Odin said, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You brought Asgard back to life." Loki smiled, for once without mockery. "And you, All-Father, gave me the stage. But tell me, when may I do it again?" Odin laughed, a sound that made the stars shine brighter. "Give us a break first, trickster, but just a short one." And with that, they raised their goblets, toasting the night, and Asgard slept in peace, the laughter still ringing in the air. Epilogue, the echo of laughter in the worlds. As dawn broke over Asgard, Valhalla lay still, but not in silence. A soft echo of laughter lingered in the air, as if the very pillars remembered the night's madness. The gods slept, exhausted from the feast, their faces softer than they had been in eons. Thor snored at a table, his beard full of mead and glitter. Freyja lay with her cats, who purred as if laughing at the memory of their giant dance. Heimdall, for once, had stopped watching for threats and dreamed of dancing bridges. Balder smiled in his sleep, his cloak still an explosion of colors. Tyr held his glove like a trophy, and the giants, Skrymir, Thrym, and Gerd, had returned to Jotunheim, their hearts lighter, their fear replaced by tales of a ballet they would never forget. Odin stood alone on a hill outside Valhalla, his mantle fluttering in the morning breeze. His eye gazed over the worlds, but for the first time in ages, it was not to seek threats or secrets. He saw the laughter that had filled Asgard, the chaos that had revived his gods. Loki had delivered, and more. The trickster himself was nowhere to be seen, perhaps hiding in the shadows, already plotting the next prank, or perhaps resting, content with his work. But Odin knew Loki's spark would never fade, not as long as Asgard stood. The sky over Asgard glowed gold once more, and Yggdrasil's branches seemed to stretch a little higher. The feast had been more than a night of laughter. It had reminded the gods why they fought, why they lived. And somewhere, in the corners of the 9 worlds, the wind carried the echo of the giant's ballet, of Thor's roar, of Freyja's giggles. Asgard was once again a place of life, and as long as Loki was around, it would never fall silent again.